Good afternoon, preppers. Welcome to Goshen Prepping. This video is centered around giving you a detailed look of what an EMP will do, why it's so destructive, and what it's going to do to the power grid, and how we actually have to handle this situation. It's a thorough video, and I hope you'll learn a lot from it. So in the end, stay to the end, I'm going to sum up exactly what you should expect from such a situation. And more specifically, as I always try to do, is give you practical advice on how to actually prepare for an EMP. You will be amazed at how an EMP is produced and how it will affect the grid. Spoiler alert, it's not a good day for grid maintenance workers, and not a good day for you at home either. When it comes to an EMP, there are three phases, simply noted as E1, E2, and E3. E1 is roughly the first half of a second after an EMP is emitted. E2 is about the second half of a second, so we're up to 1 second now. And E3, much longer than a second, can actually take a few minutes. All three are important to look at and will affect the grid differently. Let's look at E1 first. E1 is a very fast but extremely powerful pulse. In this phase, when a nuclear detonation erupts, it's actually going to release an incredible amount of high energy photons called gamma rays. To think of a gamma ray, it's simply just like light coming on your hand, but so powerful it can actually literally shed electrons off the atom itself. It puts that energy into the atom, breaks the electrons free, and sends them scattering, and this is called the photoelectric effect. The movement of electrons, simply put, is called, well, it's electricity. For example, when a wire is connected to a power source, like a battery, the two opposite charges of the battery force the electrons to move down the wire. This movement of electrons we depend on. It can turn motors, make a light bulb glow, and produce heat. Sometimes the heat's by accident, but sometimes we do it on purpose. Like, for example, in an electric heater. In a wire, we purposely slow down the movement of the electrons, which creates the heat, then we transfer it to a ceramic plate. Why? The plates disperse the heat evenly. Without them, the wires would be putting the heat directly into the air, which is not efficient, not to mention can burn up the wire. The wire can heat up too fast and melt. Keep that in mind. So the ceramic heater takes advantage of the fact that we can actually use electrons to produce heat. Neat. But when it comes to a nuclear detonation, although all nuclear detonations produce an EMP, ones in the upper atmosphere are far more problematic. They are not a problem in destruction and fallout because there won't be any, but problematic in producing an amplified EMP. It's amplified. I mean, one reason is line of sight. For example, a nuclear blast 400 miles away from your location on the ground will get obstructed. Obstructed from buildings, trees, mountains, and even the curvature of the Earth. Yes, the Earth's curvature. But a detonation in the upper atmosphere, there's nothing blocking that EMP from hitting you in your house. But that's not the reason why upper atmosphere EMPs are the problem. Our Earth actually has in the upper atmosphere a giant layer full of countless electrons and charged particles that actually help block certain things like sun rays from coming in, especially when you have sunspots and solar storms. It actually helps collect it. That's why we actually see the aurora borealis. Pretty neat. Now, what happens is as sunlight goes through the atmosphere, those light rays, even though they're not as powerful as the gamma rays, will actually scatter electrons too. And those electrons will accumulate up in that upper atmosphere. All right, because of this, we actually have such a thick layer of ions, and a nuclear detonation explodes in the ionosphere. Well, guess what? That high energy from the nuclear detonation in the EMP will take in those ions and cause a massive, massive ion storm through the EMP, far more than simply just a nuclear detonation went off toward the Earth. Think of it like a supercharged EMP heading straight for your home. Now, before we talked about the movement of electrons in a wire will produce heat. The smaller the diameter of the wire, combined with the longer the wire, will increase this tendency for heat to develop in the wire. In other words, if you actually have a very long, thin wire or a very narrow wire, expect more heat in that wire. When we install wire, like in your house, for example, we have to make sure it's the correct thickness, or gauge is what we call it, to accommodate what it's going to be used for. So when an electrician installs a wire in your home, for example, going from your breaker panel to your laundry room, maybe to power your electric clothes dryer, he has to take into account not only the distance from the breaker panel it's going to be, but also since that dryer requires so much energy, it's got to be a pretty thick wire. He has to be able to do that to accommodate that, because the longer the distance, the thicker the wire needed to handle that load. If you try to plug in a heavy-duty item beyond what was designed for that wire, it could easily cause a fire. The heavy load could melt the wire, or at least cause sparks to develop at the contact points. So what do? We install breakers in the panel that will trip if the load goes beyond what's intended. So the breakers in your breaker panel are actually really simple. Inside them, they actually have what's called a bimetallic strip. Two pieces of metal Two different metals, mind you. So when it actually gets warm, because let's say, for example, you're actually trying to produce too much, or you actually have too much of a load on it, they'll actually start to bend in a certain direction, which will trip the breaker. It's actually a mechanical movement, which actually turns off the power to that device. So that way the wire won't melt, cause sparks, or cause a fire in your home. So for example, when you turn on your microwave, also use your hair dryer and the toaster all at once, the heat inside the wire and the breaker are too much, so mechanically the breaker will trip and shut off the power. The key is the breaker will trip before any damage occurs. It's designed that way with some extra safety measure in mind. So it's going to protect your house from a fire. Hold on to that for just a moment. However, the grid itself is not protected by breakers per se. They're actually protected by what are called relays. Since your home breaker is an all-in-one device, it does two things. It detects the current flow and trips it to shut it off. It's much simpler. Grid relays are separate. We have a sensing device which monitors the grid, then computer-controlled mechanisms that trip a relay to cut off the flow of current throughout the system. And these computer-controlled mechanisms are actually made up of semiconductors. This is important to know. So here goes the high-altitude nuclear detonation. The gamma rays produce that photoelectric effect in the atmosphere, on the ground, and more importantly, in every metal structure across the country. Combined with seemingly limitless supply of electrons from the ionosphere, we have just induced a ridiculous amount of electrons flowing across the power lines in your neighborhood. One problem this causes is simply too much load for these relays. The relays will fry in this situation because, simply put, the actual sensing system can't sense it fast enough and it'll burn them up. But on a good note, even with a large yield nuclear detonation, it's estimated we'll only lose about 5% of the relays across the country. And surprisingly, they're relatively inexpensive and easy to fix. So that's not the big problem. Your home, however, is a very different story. The breakers in your house are not near fast enough to trip. Surge protectors too, they won't do anything. They will not help. Every wire plugged into outlets in your home is getting a burst of current, high current, which will fry your electronics. Now, some items in your home, like your electric range, if you have an electric one with the filaments, maybe your toaster, devices like that, or that ceramic heater, they're actually meant for a lot of the heat, so they'll probably be okay. But any device that actually has a semiconductor chip, those microchips are especially vulnerable to high currents, and they stand an excellent chance of being fried if it's connected to the grid, which means plugged into your wall in your house. Not only will that pulse of current more than likely fry every chip connected to your home, it's actually possible and probable that some microchips will fry that aren't even connected, as long as they're close enough to the wires in your home electrical wiring. It literally can arc across that electric wire into your device and fry it. Let's say you have a computer or a laptop or a tablet near the electrical wiring, it could still fry that device. And that's why we recommend you put those small devices in a Faraday cage. I always just recommend like a big aluminum trash can with a lid over it, and that should be just fine. Not should be, it will be just fine enough to protect those devices. Microchips far enough away from electrical wires in your home might survive. They have a good chance. The EMP pulse doesn't necessarily mess with semiconductors on its own, although it can happen, but instead will fry these chips when connected to or near a long wire. Your car, for example, since it has a limited amount of wiring in it, and mostly a metal shell for protection, and it's not connected to the grid, it will probably run after an EMP. Studies show that most cars will, even modern cars, which is kind of surprising. However, if that modern car happens to be an electric car, especially one that's actually plugged in for charging, it's probably going to get fried. So in short, the E1 pulse could cause major problems in your home and maybe a few relays in the grid, but overall the grid will still be functioning. The E2 pulse is actually not much of a problem. It's actually comparable to lightning. And since we've dealt with lightning for a long time, most of the structures we have in both the power grid and your home are actually protected from lightning. So the E2 is probably not going to affect us very much. Then comes E3. It's a slow wave, but the way it interacts with the ionosphere can literally induce voltage into those long wires like power lines. So ultimately, it's going to shift the ionosphere and disrupt it. That may not seem like a problem, but it is. So here's the Earth, upper atmosphere, we have an ionosphere. And if you actually have an EMP in that ionosphere, or if you have a sunspot with a coronal ejection hitting it, either one of those is going to shift the ionosphere across the Earth. And whenever you actually have that movement of charged particles, electricity. So as it moves across from the detonation or from the sunspot, the coronal ejection, and then it basically is going to take a few minutes to reset, that massive amount of charge moving back and forth is actually going to induce a current into those long power lines again. In this case, the stuff in your home is probably already fried at this point, but it's actually the power plants, well, the power grid itself we have to worry about. When this current is induced, it will cause an overload of transformers and will fry them, actually make them explode permanently. And worse yet, since we're talking about an EMP in the upper atmosphere, which can actually hit a large part of the country, we're not talking about just a few transformers, both the ones on the poles and in the power substations. And now we're talking about a massive amount, if not most of the transformers across the country exploding, knocking out power nationwide. Can you imagine this happening to virtually every transformer across the country? It's a very, very real possibility and probability too. The problem is worse though. We have very few replacements on hand, and it will take well over a year at full production to finally replace all those transformers. And we're talking about a year, bare minimum. It could be much longer than that. And more than likely, 2 or 3 years. And guess what? You and your home, you are the least priority. They're actually going to have priorities in military bases. Of course, this is going to be attack, isn't it? Hospitals, emergency services, then to finally businesses, etc. Your house, you're not going to have power for a long, long time. So end result, here's what we'll face in an upper atmosphere EMP. The nuclear detonation will have no effect, no fallout, no radiation. You may not even detect it. The first wave, E1, less than half a second, will cause minimal damage to the grid, but will have devastating damage to any and all electronics connected or near the power grid in your house. The third wave, E3, will fry potentially all transformers in the grid itself, resulting in a complete collapse of the grid. Even though the power plants themselves can restart with minor repairs, the grid itself will be down for at least a year, probably much longer. So, practical advice, how can we prepare for this? First, any devices, electronic devices that are important to you, you need to put them into a Faraday cage. Again, it's really simple. Expect grocery stores, gas stations, restaurants, supply chains, all businesses will be shut down for a long time. And it will be nothing less than a major economic catastrophe hitting the country. It is one of the worst scenarios that we could actually have to deal with, because not only are we talking about the grid being down, but we're also talking about probably launching the United States into a major war. Man, I wouldn't want to even think about this even actually happening, but it's a real possibility. So practically prepare for it and just hope and pray it doesn't happen. Thanks for watching.